Right, now moving on to topic 4. It's something a bit quirky and a bit niche. Chinese bootleg comics. Now, if you're friends with Craig Spivey or you follow him on Instagram, over the course of December he treated us to an incredible image every day of December, like a bit like an advent calendar. Now, Craig, I'm going to let you run with this because quite an interesting topic, and you're bang on it.
Bang on it. Okay, what are we looking at? We're looking at Chinese unlicensed lianhuanhua comic books. Can we all say that? Lianhuanhua.
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 Lianhuanhua?
That's it. It's close enough. So it's Lianhuanhua. And these are unique to China. They're almost postcard sized. So they're about 5 inches by 3.5 inches. They have colour covers, black and white pages. But unlike comic books as we know them, they tend to be one illustration per page with text underneath. So it's more like a little sequential picture book. And it's something that I started picking up a couple of years ago. I read about them online and it just piqued my interest. And initially it was all the weirdness that appealed. But, you know, as I got into them, there's a real charm to the art style. And the circumstances of how they came to exist is just a fascinating story. So as it stands in the Western world, there are only kind of 14 known comic adaptations for the original Star Wars trilogy. And to be fair, 2 of those don't really fit the format. So they're a bit of a stretch. As a collectible, they're relatively affordable, about £20 a copy I've been paying. So for something unusual and quirky as this, I don't think that's too bad. But I'm flying blind with it. There's not a lot of information out there. There's a few people who've collated a bit of information, but I can't read Chinese. So it's, you know, it feels like the frontier of collecting for me in a world of palatoy matrices and areas of collecting that have been documented to the most finite detail. This is kind of strange and alien and uncharted, and I love it. They're a recent-ish discovery for people and collectors in the Western world. It wasn't until around May 2014 that this stuff came to light. And it came to light because there was an American history professor who had a passion for Chinese comics, a lady by the name of Maggie Green, who worked at Montana State University. And she was out in Shanghai and she visited a book fair. And that's where she discovered sort of the first of these lianhuanhua, which had the name Xingqi Da Zan, which I like because it's almost got the word X-Wing in and it's got Zan in, obviously a great EU writer. But at first glance, you could be forgiven for not realising that this little comic had anything to do with Star Wars because it only bears a passing resemblance to any of the characters. But she took this thing home and she blogged about it, and the likes of IO9 and Gizmodo, Mental Floss, kind of all delighted in its weirdness and reblogged it. So in 2004, it kind of blew up, and there were lots of sort of blogs written about this thing, and that's where it sort of first came to light, really. That first one that she discovered was dated in 1980, obviously the height of the Cold War. The Chinese wouldn't have had any access to any official Star Wars films or material, and presumably not much leaked out of the factories from Hong Kong and Macau, which at the time were UK and Portuguese territories. So that flow of information clearly wasn't there, but there was an appetite to get in on the Star Wars action. So it was actually 4 decades before Chinese people could actually see the classic trilogy in cinemas for the first time. But back in the 80s and the late 70s, there's clearly lack of source material. So it's understandable that some of the scenes and the characters' designs vary massively from what we know. I think it's worth just a very, very little bit of history into lianhuanhua because I didn't know any of this, and I'm sure there's a fair proportion of our listeners won't know it either. But the name essentially means linked pictures or serial pictures. And these things date back to the 1800s, where they have their links with Chinese magazines. There was a large audience of middle and lower class readers that they would bind these stories into separate volumes. And that just grew with the rise of lithographic printing that came from the West. So by the 1920s, there were a few of these around, but they tended to focus on things like Chinese mythology or folklore. And they were targeted at kids and marginally literate readers. And rather than buy them, people would rent them. So you could rent these little comic books from kiosks around the 1920s. So they were part of the cultural landscape, I think, of China. So by the 70s, they'd kind of disappeared from Hong Kong, which would have been our link to behind the bamboo curtain. it sort of decreased a little bit during the Cultural Revolution, but they were still used for propaganda and education. So the format of these little pocket comics kept going, and they made a comeback in the late 70s and the 80s when they started to adapt films and TV shows from the Western world. And when you look at what was produced and what's out there, it's a really eclectic mix. You've got things like Tarzan, Charlie Chaplin, Sherlock Holmes, Zorro, which for sort of the late 70s to have a Charlie Chaplin comic seems a bit sort of strange to me. But this continued, and obviously it grew to take in Star Wars, but it's since kind of died off. So a lot of these things are kind of vintage specifically to that era. So since this first lianhuanhua book was found by Maggie Green, a few have appeared on the market, and to date there have been 6 different adaptations of A New Hope, 4 different adaptations of The Empire Strikes Back, and then there are 3 editions of kind of reworked continuing adventures, really. But the oldest and the first one is this one that Maggie found, and it's arguably the weirdest, and it's where I drew a lot of the images I shared on Instagram and on the Beyond the Toys group in December. So what we're looking at is these comics that, you know, the writers knew the story of Star Wars, but the artists didn't necessarily have all the visual reference to hand. So there's some real strange mashups of imagery. And because we all know Star Wars so well and we're all so familiar with it, some of it is just comical. Just to list a few of the random images that appeared in this first one, you've got the Rebel base labelled as the Kennedy Space Center on Darth Vader's map of the galaxy. Chewbacca's very much like a monkey from Planet of the Apes. Spaceships resemble Cold War 1950s aircraft. There's a panel with Darth Vader riding a Triceratops dinosaur. Obi-Wan's riding into battle with his lightsaber aloft on what's looks like a Judge Dredd motorbike. Ben's hovel features a stack of whiskey barrels with J&B written on them. The Last Homestead is it's like a Frank Lloyd Wright style house. Aunt Beru's kitchen's got cheese plants in it and looks like a 70s Habitat catalogue. And there's just lots and lots of that stuff where the artists have had to just fill in the gaps, really, in their knowledge and taken whatever sources that they can find from Western culture and just appropriated it into these Star Wars stories. And it makes for such a curious document. So that first issue, if you're of a mind to, it was translated by a chap called Nick Stember, and you can visit nickstember.com and you can read the actual translation of the Chinese and see those images. Out of the images that I put out there, and obviously, you know, I limited myself to 25 because that's what advent calendars do. And I also made sure that they had some Star Wars reference in them, because some of the panels are so obscure that people probably wouldn't have made that connection. So I did deliberately try and show stuff that was relatable. Does anything stand out to anyone?
Absolutely. There's 3 that I absolutely love, and at the time I thought just great. I think the first one is Princess Leia in Bespin gear with her jebs out. I thought that was
I was just looking at that one. Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. I mean, just great. Second one is seeing Boba Fett blow the crap out of 2-1B as he's storming out of Slave One. I thought that was great. I mean, poor 2-1B just, you know, stood there minding his own business, and Boba Fett just blasting through and shooting the crap out of him. And then the one that really sticks out for me is the one where I presume it's Han Solo and Lando Calrissian hugging. And it looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger is grappling Eddie Murphy. And Arnie looks really happy, but Eddie Murphy looks really, really upset about something. And what a cracking image! I don't know what the artist was on. I mean, they're on some serious opium stuff over there. But yeah, it's just cracking images, really sort of far out, drugged up imagery. Brilliant! I love it.
I think what's apparent with the Boba Fett and the 2-1B is that if you look through that particular issue, and that's the one we've just been talking about, the Imperial Stormtroopers are dressed as Boba Fett, which is kind of poetic when given what we know about the prequels now, you know, and the origins of that armor. And the 2-1B characters are kind of Imperial officers that are littered around the place at control centers and pushing buttons and things. So the artist has seen those characters and gone, oh, they must work on the Death Star or the Space Center.
I think for me, the thing that really stands out to me is that the Chinese, they couldn't have had the grasp of Star Wars that we have. They couldn't have understood it in the same way that we understood it. They will have interpreted it in a different way. They must have done, obviously, because of the imagery that we're seeing and the stuff that they created is so far removed from what we know as Star Wars. It must have been a fascinating process to watch these artists translate and then communicate to their audience, which is a different audience again, the story of Star Wars. Incredible, really.
I mean, they vary. Some are quite close, but have sort of noticeable differences, and others are just out there.
I love Greedo in the drink with Han. It's that if you couldn't tell that was Han, you'd wonder what the hell was going on in that picture, wouldn't you? Because
with all its eyes. Yeah,
it's got like a Chinese lantern on his head, hasn't it, or something? It's an incredible image. It's just really, really odd. And I also love the interrogation droid with the
tentacles.
With the tentacles coming out and Leia kind of arms in the air, doing some kind of like as if she's stoned dance in front of it. Tarkin looks like a win or something, doesn't he?
There's one where Tarkin's rendered as a sort of Ming the Merciless character.
Yeah, he is. Yeah,
that's a slightly dodgy racial stereotype from the 1930s of what Western culture thought baddies were that has gone full circle and just most bizarre. What you find with them is a mishmash of Western sci-fi imagery from a few decades. So you do get ships that look like War Rocket Ajax and things like that. And then you get ships that look like the 1970s Buck Rogers. And then you get 1950s astronauts with the big, goldfish bowl helmets and things. So it's a real blend of presumed imagery, I think. Oh, well, it's sci-fi, so they probably look a bit like this.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Craig, can I just ask you, just remind us what year did these come out?
So they went between, I think the earliest is around 1980, and the latest, I think, is around 89 is the latest one.
Because they seem to be confused, don't they? They've mixed films together. They've got different characters. You're like, well, hang on a second. So you're quite clearly showing Leia there, but she's Leia. This is meant to be a New Hope theme, but she's got a Endor Forest haircut. Or this one is from A New Hope, but then Leia's looking more like Leia from Jabba's palace. So yeah, there's definite confusion. You go back to the one Mark pointed out, which was Leia. He called Cheb's Leia, I think. And so that one's got more of a sort of Amidala style haircut, some incredible foreshadowing there. But actually, if you looked really, really closely, I don't think what Mark thought he saw. Actually, I think if you look at the chest, it's Order 66, because they look like two sixes to me. That's what I'm seeing there, but possibly not. And then you move down.
I've been staring at that too long. Sorry, man.
You wonder why I've been quiet. Then you've got there's one which you had put on when you did the Instagram, because obviously I follow you, and it was window number 18, and you've got Boba Fett without his helmet, and it looks like Luke. So it looks like Luke under a Boba Fett with some sort of Princess Leia, sort of half Organa, but half handcuffs and leg showing from sort of Return of the Jedi. So all sorts of peculiar. But
it's the I'm Luke Skywalker, I'm here to rescue you scene. So if you think that they've drawn all the stormtroopers as Boba Fett, that's his. And because she's imprisoned, she looks like a damsel in distress. It's nothing like what we know. So
there's confusion all round. But what I like, so I wrote about the Boba Fett one, shooting the 2-1B. I thought that was great. It's a very dynamic picture, not just because of the, oil and hydraulic fluid and various different things coming out of 2-1B, but the flowing cape of the Mandalorian I loved. But I think one of my favourites was you talk about sort of folklore and stuff with Wookiees pulling people's arms off. Joy don't do that. But it was there's a picture there of it's one of the early ones, I think. I'm just scanning now through my phone. Yeah, window number 2. So you've got a rather sort of rough looking Chewbacca, and he's holding a lifeless stormtrooper by the neck, and it looks like he's just about to pull his leg off, and there's other stormtroopers sort of just thrown around the room. To me, that's brilliant. I love that one.
Doesn't Chewbacca changed drastically
Yeah.
in the imagery, though. The picture of him with 3PO laying down, well, you've written it on your write-up, Andre the Giant. That's exactly what he looks like. It's if you had said, who is that, I wouldn't have guessed instantly Chewbacca. It's really odd.
He suffers the worst out of all of the characters. Throughout all of these books, he's the most inaccurate. But not only between books. There are some of these books where he changes halfway through. They change artists halfway through, and he's drawn like a chimp. He looks like Planet of the Apes Chewbacca. So it's just full of really bizarre interpretations, and the circumstances around this stuff being produced with very little references is fascinating to me. And the artifacts that it's produced, I think, are just charming and rich and varied. I tried to show the range of styles that these things were drawn in. One of them is very, very stylized in terms of its kind of light and shade. It's quite a really bold art style. And then there's other ones which is quite wispy and almost psychedelic.
The Obi-Wan smoking a pipe.
Yeah.
It's just very, very Jesus-like, actually, isn't he? In his
sort of very ethereal sort of. And I think that comes from one of the rarer ones. The artist working on that one, there's the Empire Strikes Back version, and they've got Yoda in there, and he looks like something from the Moomins. He's got these big eyes and these little pointy ears. And so, as I've said, there are around 14 of these things, but I think there must be loads of these out there. And there's a lot more to discover. So alongside the adaptations of the movies, what they also did was they translated some of the Russ Manning cartoon strips from the newspapers. So there's a set of 3 of those which I've come across, which contain different stories from those continuing adventures, and they're quite faithfully reproduced for the most part. As these things were developed, they clearly went to lots of different publishing houses, lots of different artists worked on them. And the results reflect that. They're very, very varied, and that's what kind of makes it interesting to me. And I think alongside these small comic books, there's a whole breadth of similarly illustrated and presumably just as bootlegged illustrated novelizations. You get sort of sci-fi stories and fantasy story compendiums, much like we did in the UK, the Marks and Spencer's ones, where you get a collection of stories together, and the tentpole is Star Wars, and you get some crazy illustrations in there. So I think what's out there, to my knowledge, is the tip of the iceberg. There's clearly an appetite for this stuff, and I'm looking forward to sort of unearthing more of it.
Superb information, mate. And Craig's already done a fantastic blog post over on www.generationskywalker.com, and you will see all of these images plus a whole host more. And he's put in some amazing information into that blog, basically running with what he said here, but gone in more depth and showing you a whole array of stuff. Craig, fantastic, mate.